So, community and communism in relation to the clinic. So this talk is going to be in three parts. I'm going to talk about the relationship between psychoanalysis and revolution in different contexts, and I'm going to outline the rationale for a recently co-authored project, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, that I wrote with David Pavon-Cuellar. Then I'm going to describe a recent attempt to set up a Red Clinic in the UK as an internationalist initiative, making connections while respecting the necessary disconnection between politics and clinical work, between the Red and the clinical aspects of our work. And then thirdly, in the third part, I'm going to look at the difference between closed bureaucratic visions of communism, those that I characterize as Stalinist communism, Stalinist realism, and a more inclusive democratic conception of communism and its implications for psychoanalytic work. And perhaps it would, we'll see how it goes. Okay then, so the first part is on psychoanalysis and then revolution. And the way into this is through the co-authored book project, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, Critical Psychology for Liberation Movements, in which David Pavon-Cuellar in Mexico and I articulate psychoanalysis with the practice of different left movements. We are addressing activists in a number of different movements, ranging from explicitly anti-capitalist groups to ecological, indigenous and feminist networks, and we're using the signifier critical psychology for liberation movements. We're using that signifier, critical psychology, strategically to speak about psychoanalysis. And we're concerned here with practice, here political practice. But we know that there's no direct, unmediated practice as such, that it must be mediated. Practice is always mediated, explicitly or implicitly, by a theory of the world and a theory of the human subject. And if it's not made explicit and reflected upon, worked through, then that mediation is usually, by default, ideological. The conceptual underpinnings of the project are more specific than the title of the book indicates, because of the theoretical and practical commitments that we both have to Lacan and to Marx. But that isn't the main focus of the book. Let's look at the question of psychoanalysis and revolution from two different perspectives. First, from the perspective of psychoanalysis, and then from the perspective of revolution. And then I'll attempt to knit them together. That's what the book tries to do. So the first perspective, from psychoanalysis, might look a little simplistic to those already versed in psychoanalytic theory and practice, but bear with me, because this really is addressed to the revolutionaries, and I speak as a psychoanalyst here. I want them to listen in and understand what I'm saying about this project. So I try to answer along the way the question as to why revolutionaries should take psychoanalysis seriously. So this covers some of the most radical aspects of psychoanalysis that we should already know. Psychoanalysis is a theory and practice of our personal, most intimate experience of subjectivity, what it is to be a human subject, an experience that is intimately bound up with language, of what it is to speak of our experience and what the effects of that are. The link between subjectivity and language is why, from the beginning, psychoanalysis was described by one of the first patients as a talking cure. Our distress at living in unbearable conditions that is tied to what has happened to us, or what we think has happened, is difficult to think about, is trapped inside us, and that distress festers inside our minds and we push it away. That's exhausting. It's pushed into our bodies. That's how we live it and repress it, and then in distorted form express it. I think it's always important to remember that it wasn't always like this. Freud invented the theory and practice of psychoanalysis, and in the process he had to invent this approach from the cultural historical resources that were available to him. He gave a name to what we push away, to what we repress, what we cannot think about, that is, the unconscious. So I would insist that it's not, as some psychiatrists and psychologists would have it, that Freud discovered the unconscious, but he invented it. And that invention enabled Freud to key into the personal experience of alienation in this political economic system that we live under, one that was gathering power as the dominant set of social relations as he developed his theory, that is capitalism. That also enabled Freud to key into abuse of power, particularly of women, and to home in on what had become so painful to speak about, that is, sex. In Freud's work at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, and then in the writings of his followers, we have much puzzling and theorizing about what this sex is that psychoanalysis talks about. And some will tie sex to biological urges, which I think is a dead end. Some will tie it to the need for love and a connection with others, which I think is a better bet. And psychoanalysis carries on working with images and metaphors that mean that psychoanalysis speaks of its time, of its own place in history. For example, and this is just one example, Freud refers to women's sexuality as dark continent. And he writes that phrase, dark continent, in English. So we have colonial metaphors, images of uncivilized, barbaric, natural, untamed desires, here being used to talk about what the human being is. But Freud is describing and finding a way for us to think and talk about patriarchy. He's not prescribing it, and this is crucial. And this is something that feminist psychoanalysts have insisted upon. Freud is not saying this is how things should be. Okay, sometimes he does, yes, and some psychoanalysts, conservative psychoanalysts, think that is the way things should be. But Freud is also focusing on how things have come to be how they are, how we live them. And this is why many of the psychoanalysts in Central Europe, before the rise of fascism, were on the left. They were supporters or members of the socialist parties or the communist parties, and that's why Freud himself spoke during the Hungarian Revolution. As it was growing, the Hungarian Revolution was just unfolding in 1918. He spoke of the need for psychoanalysis being available in the early equivalent of a national health service, a free national health service. So psychoanalysis was radical, and it was linked to radical movements. It spoke of distress, and it opened a space for people to speak of their distress, to put it into words, to make it in some limited way in the contained space of the clinic public. So there are limits. It's a contained space, but it's public, more public. Did it become an elite treatment in conditions of exile after it was driven out by the fascists and condemned as a Jewish science? Yes. But what in this world has not been recuperated, neutralized, and absorbed, turned into a commodity for those who can afford it? What psychoanalysis spoke about then is still the case now, maybe even more so. The political economic system it described as capitalism and patriarchy organized around the nuclear family has spread around the world. Now, many of us speak about sex a lot, or we try to avoid speaking about it. But the key is that it's the commodification of sex and the intensification of its links with power, with humiliation and shame that makes it so touchy, sometimes impossible to speak about. Now, like psychoanalysis itself, sex has been turned into something to be bought and sold. So we repeat self-destructive images of ourselves that we learnt, and those self-destructive images become linked to toxic images of sex and our bodies and the colour of our skin. That's why anti-colonial psychoanalysts like Frantz Fanon, who worked in a psychiatric hospital and then joined the Algerian independence movement, that's why Fanon saw psychoanalysis as a way of accounting for what drives the racist oppressors as well as the oppressed into miserable exercises of power or subjugation, self-hatred. When we speak to a psychiatrist about our distress, their medical training, the psychiatrist's medical training, makes them look for illness and search for drugs or physical treatments to cure us. When we speak to a psychologist, they focus on the bad thoughts and try to put them right, usually in line with what they've been told is right. When we speak to a psychotherapist, they too often so want to help us, they have a too clear idea of what would help. That is, unless they are psychoanalytic psychotherapists, and then they should know better. And I think we should remember here, by the by, that psychoanalytic work is not confined to psychoanalysts as such, but that approach. Its radical elements, the radical elements of psychoanalysis can be there in the practice of psychoanalytic psychotherapists and psychodynamic counselors. And part of the problem radical practitioners face today is a status hierarchy that distorts psychoanalytic work, that divides these different kinds of practitioners. So, there is an internal struggle in and against the professions that we psychoanalysts must engage in. Psychoanalysis is part of the psi professions. It's moulded by its collusion and the turf wars with psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors. And so psychoanalysis needs to set itself against the psi professions to be able to reclaim its radical history, breaking from the idea that there's something fixed in human nature, or the supposed nature of gender and sexuality or race, that it should organize its theory and practice around. And I think if it breaks from its enclosure in private practice, if it reaches out again to politics, then it can link personal change with social change, and it can be revolutionary. Okay, let's look at this another way now, this connection between psychoanalysis and revolution, from the perspective of revolution. I'm going to cover some of the same ground again, but now I'm going to be speaking as a revolutionary, as a revolutionary Marxist. So that limits what I say in some ways, but this is in order to speak across from revolutionary politics to psychoanalytic people, psychoanalytic types, to those who actually might be too closely wedded to their psychoanalytic ideas. There are some parallels, but maybe more than that. And the better the book is that it's more than that. There are more than parallels between psychoanalysis and revolutionary politics. It can be more than that. So we rebel against racist, heteropatriarchal capitalism, not only because this political economic system is unfair and ruinous, with the drive for profit destroying the planet. Short-term gain exploits nature with no thought for the consequences for humankind, let alone the other species we share this earth with. It's not only that the development and globalization of capitalism requires colonial power and the power of the male heads of the household in the nuclear family. It's not only that, but it is also that this capitalism systematically distorts who and what we are in our relations with nature and with each other. And that distortion also fuels a desperate search for what we have lost, what we think we've lost. It promotes an equally self-destructive images sometimes of what our supposedly real nature is. And that real nature, that image of the real nature, is modelled on commodified images of ourselves that are sold to us. That, at its core, was what fired Marx to develop his critique of capitalist critical economy as a critique that was designed not merely to interpret the world, but to change it. It was designed to harness the consciousness of those who labour, those whose labour power is exploited. And the alienation that Marx described was of our separation of our creative labour from what we produce. When others control and sell the fruits of our labour, it was about separation of us from each other in competition for jobs and resources. It was about separation of ourselves from our own bodies that are turned into instruments of labour, and separation from nature as such, which is viewed then as something to be dominated, as a threat, maybe sometimes something to be romanticized as well. which isn't much better. So that critique of capitalism that Marx gave us chimes with other critiques of exploitation and oppression from feminism and anti-colonial politics, and they not only force Marxists to take sexism and racism seriously, but they provide their own autonomous leadership of liberation movements. And it was anti-racist and feminist theorists who also showed how pernicious and insidious alienation is, how it leads people to blame themselves for distress. That's a function, distress that's a function of this political economic system. And they, the feminists and anti-colonial activists, reminded us that Marxists should experience that exploitation, that we experience that exploitation and oppression at depth within us. And we reproduce it in our relations with others. So that is structural, systemic, beyond consciousness, and we need to tackle political and personal resistance to be able to think about what's happening to us and work through how we collude with it. So here is reason enough to be suspicious of the psi professions who ask us to forget about changing the world and to just change ourselves, to adapt better to this wretched existence. When socialist feminists argued inside and alongside Marxist organizations that the personal is political, they already knew that it would be a mistake to dissolve politics into personal change. They didn't need Marxists who wanted to caricature their slogan to tell them that. And it means that they, the feminists, demand of any approach to personal change, any attempt to tackle the distress that paralyzes people and stops them from struggling against oppression, that they should also tackle the problem of individualization, competitive individualism that is part and parcel of alienation. For revolutionaries of all kinds, the psi professions, who have crystallized a status hierarchy with psychoanalysts at the top, psychotherapists below them as a kind of obedient second tier, and the many counsellors, most of whom are women, working class women at the bottom. That status hierarchy sometimes reminds revolutionaries of terrible betrayals and bureaucratization in their own history of struggle. For Marxists, for example, this will strike a chord, because this bureaucratization reminds them of the awful betrayal of the hopes of real change in the early years of the Russian Revolution, and reminds them of the way that the Stalinist bureaucracy revived racist Russian chauvinism and anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, at the same time as it outlawed again homosexuality, reinforced the power of the nuclear family and the power of men. Some Marxists will be dimly aware that psychoanalysis was prohibited in the Soviet Union in the 1930s under Stalin, as well as in Germany under Hitler, and that opposition figures like Leon Trotsky defended the psychoanalysts. Why would that be? So many activists in the revolutionary anti-Stalinist tradition, as well as those in feminist and anti-colonial movements, were drawn to psychoanalysis. Our worry has always been that they could have been drawn in too far, to the point where they swapped one belief system. If they thought that Marxism was a belief system, they swapped that belief system for another. So they turned their kind of faith in revolutionary theory into faith in psychoanalysis, as a kind of all-encompassing worldview that would explain everything, anything and everything, back to the dawn of time. So there's a keen reminder of that to anyone who wants to tackle the distress that we suffer, that they need to know that our revolutionary ideas do not actually function as a belief system at all. Rather, these ideas are tools of struggle, and those tools of struggle are themselves historical, and they're transformed when they engage with and change social reality. So the questions that revolutionaries might pose to the psychoanalysts are questions that also point back to them. You could say that the questions are necessarily reflexive. That is, the questions have consequences for those who ask them, as well as those they demand answers from. Questions like, are you going to listen to us without fitting what we say into your own theoretical grid, reducing us to it? Are you going to offer us a space to speak that enables us to transform ourselves? Can you do that without attempting to predict or pathologize what we might make of ourselves? Are you up to the task of transforming yourself as a result of listening to us? Can you make another world possible that does not need your kind psychoanalysts in it, so that you're self-critical of the identity that you've won for yourself in your training as psychoanalysts? So this manifesto, this book, Revolution, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, makes a case that there's a struggle at work inside the history of psychoanalysis and its intersection with revolutionary struggle. It's a struggle between a conservative, bureaucratized, professional apparatus that wants to adapt people to reality, and another tradition that has attempted to answer these questions, that has attempted and sometimes failed. And I think it's the attempts that say something about the nature of psychoanalysis, which is that it could be revolutionary. Okay, that was the first part. The first part was about psychoanalysis and revolution. The second part is about the Red Clinic. It's about how to put some of these radical ideas into practice. It's something that I've been working on with other radical colleagues. So I want to describe the Red Clinic to you. This initiative of the Red Clinic, we said at the outset, would be informed by Marxist, anti-racist, queer feminist and radical disability theories. It should also be explicitly internationalist. And we began with an outline of where we were up to and gave examples of the kind of work we had in mind. So the Red Clinic initiative is in its early days. It began in London following a mental health workers' inquiry to explore clinical approaches that foreground anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. So we're dealing here with at least two issues. One is the nature of global capitalism, which, intersecting with vicious racism and sexism, is driving spiraling rates of distress. So mental health suffering is a political matter. The other is access to mental health support, the access, with privatization of services replicating the isolation that people feel. So mental health provision is a political matter. So there was a decision by a small group of radical therapists and lawyers and activists to set up something that would badge itself as run by communists. That was quite deliberate. And this term, communist, is deliberately chosen here to point to the need for collectively run services that increase people's capacity to themselves engage in conscious activity together with others to change the world. Solidarity in the practice of therapy, in its form as well as its content, is crucial here. Perhaps it would be possible, we thought, for those committed to this project to bring in therapists to work face-to-face and online. So the Red Clinic began to advertise for therapists. It was thinking that it would employ therapists who would take on high fee-paying clients in order to subsidize work with a low or no fee-paying client. Well, actually, that's something that many radical therapists already do in their private practice. We started to think about how to manage this, and then it seemed difficult, so we took a step back. It seemed too much of a stretch with such a small group that we had working with us to do all of this. So now the Red Clinic is regrouping, taking another step forward, but on two tracks of work, and one track is to engage in political dialogue with practitioners and to set up a political education program to discuss how to connect therapy with radical theory and practice. The other track of work is to build bases for the Red Clinic and to work out how to offer practical clinical support to those in distress, including working with trades unions, grassroots organizations, and social movements. So we need to be clear that this project is riddled with problems, with issues that we believe can only be worked through in collective discussion and practice. So we've had many meetings with other people discussing this, and these problems, we know, also can't be solved in the abstract by good theory. So we began this process now by setting out some of the dilemmas that we face. And these are some of the dilemmas. First of all, what do we mean by therapy? Is therapy to be underpinned by radical psychoanalytic ideas about the unconscious and the way that past relationships are replicated and worked through in the clinic? Or does it include client-centered humanist approaches that focus on personal growth? Also cognitive behavioral approaches that offer short-term alternative ways of reframing problems? And what about group analytic approaches that are already collective? We think that it includes all of these things and more. And that means that practitioners with different understandings of the ways that societal distress gets inside people will be working together in the Red Clinic. So how do we handle those disagreements? That's the question. Second, what do we mean by radical politics? So we say in our outline on the website, we say we're communist. And we hope it's clear that this means that we work in the spirit of the most open and materialist intersectional understanding of how exploitation and oppression works. But does that mean that a good therapist is necessarily a communist of this kind and should say so? What are the consequences of that for the expectations of those who might read this when they're seeking help? What expectations will they have of the therapist that they meet in the Red Clinic? How does that political commitment express itself, if not in turning the therapy itself into a form of political education, which, to be clear, I think it shouldn't? So how do we avoid turning therapy into propaganda? That's the question. Third question, must people be radical? Must they be turned into radicals? And there's a question here about what commitment we expect from those who access the service. If they're not paying, which they should not, they should not even now in the shrinking welfare provision and state-funded health services. We need to ask how therapy can operate as a space for people to speak in confidence without being judged. How can it operate if there's an implicit expectation that they're radical? How could they be engaged in a radical political project called the Red Clinic alongside and as an intimate part of a project to understand their distress and change the way they engage in the world? So how do we release service users from the demand to be good radicals? There's a fourth question. And the fourth question is, what do we mean by collective? So this signifier, communist, I think is not enough, given the history of the way the term has been used and abused. It's not enough to guide us. And there are institutional obstacles to that. The therapy as a private, enclosed space is necessarily in some way outside the collective sphere. It is enclosed. It is a kind of refuge and a space to speak without the usual consequences of speaking to a family member or an expert or indeed a comrade. So advice is absent. So is commitment to the usual kind of interaction in everyday life. So the collective work of the institution of any clinic is actually suspended, paradoxically, in the actual clinic room. So how do we square our social project with personal change? It's a question. If these were not problems enough, there are more. The very small numbers involved and the conditions in which we work mean that online therapy will likely be the main option for a while. But that's a form of work that has also an alienating, isolating effect that runs counter to the ethos of the Red Clinic. What it is to be collective in these conditions changes radically. That also means that our internationalism takes on a different form. It threatens to be reduced to a kind of tokenism in which we link with radical therapists in different parts of the world and work out what we can offer each other practically in terms of support. But some things are happening as a result of that online work. We have support for Arabic-speaking groups in Palestine that we've set up already. So that the online work has enabled something. There are, in post-pandemic global capitalism, a host of issues that compound those that have beset red or radical therapy initiatives in the past. We know we're reinventing some of those past initiatives in new conditions, and we need help to do that, which is why a meeting in a context of a strike in Manchester seemed a good place for us to start to begin again. That's what we did in the middle of the lecturers' strike. We had a meeting to discuss the Red Clinic. So we were asking whether we could do this and how, and whether different questions and answers can be developed if we're to have any success in the project. Where we're up to now is that we have colleagues in Slovenia who think of communism here through a kind of Lacanian lens, actually the work of Alain Badiou. We're learning from colleagues in India and Taiwan, where there are very different contexts for talking about communism. And we started a clinical support group for Palestinian therapists, which, as I said, has been operating in English and now operating in Arabic in 2 different supervision groups. So that's the Red Clinic. The Red Clinic takes forward some of the ideas that I outlined in connecting psychoanalysis and revolution and tries to take them forward. It's a place for me to take them forward, and other people working in the Red Clinic have slightly different takes on this, but this is my take. That was my take in the second part of the talk. I want to turn to the third part of the talk, and the third part of the talk is you need the first 2 parts in a way to make sense of this, and it's a little bit more complex, but here it goes. And it's about Stalinist realism and open communism in relation to class in psychoanalysis. And it also builds on some of the ideas in a recently published book called Stalinist Realism and Open Communism, published by Resistance Books in London, by my comrades in London. So what I want to do is I want to move back to some theoretical reflections on the attempt to connect therapy with politics. And this third part engages particularly with the questions of identity and class in psychoanalysis, identity and class. So these terms, identity and class, are signifiers. And while these signifiers, these terms, may indeed correspond to entities outside language, the way we discuss and so understand signifiers is freighted with meanings that are given by their relation to other terms and by historical context. There are social theorists who have drawn heavily on psychoanalysis and who've eventually abandoned key tenets of Marxism, claiming that the term class no longer corresponds to an economic political entity. And I'm thinking here of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. For them, the term class is now only seen by some of the ex-Marxists or so-called post-Marxists, only seen as a signifier that constitutes a form of identity. Well, in speech inside the clinic, we track and intervene in the domain of signifiers. That's where we work. We work with signifiers, the forms of language. And how we mark them and interpret how they structure and anchor lives will have real consequences as well as therapeutic effects. But, and this is the crucial clinical psychoanalytic point, we don't do this by pinning down their supposed real underlying meaning. or what we think is their real underlying meaning within our own coordinates as analysts who imagine that they know what's outside language. But rather, we facilitate a different, freer relation to language, and so also to reality. To spell out what we think the signifiers that appear in the clinic really mean to us and to our analysans, what they should mean to our analysans, I think is a manifestation of what I call Stalinist realism. Here, I use this term, Stalinist realism, to describe a toxic complement to capitalist realism that tells us that this capitalism is the way the world is and that there's no alternative. It's a term, capitalist realism. It was taken from a book published in 2009 by Mark Fisher. Very, very, very good book and a very useful book. But the term Stalinist realism is a kind of complement to capitalist realism. The possible freer relation to language and reality enabled by our clinical work is potentially, and only potentially, because we can't guide the politics of our analysans, potentially what I call open communism. So here, a real alternative is possible, including an alternative to the regimes that masqueraded as socialist and were threatened by such practices as psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis banned in Russia. It threatened the bureaucracy. So I say this as a communist who fights politically for an open democratic form of communism that must of necessity pit itself against the Stalinist tradition. That Stalinist tradition is a tradition that turns Marxism from being an analysis and a guide to changing the world into a kind of faith or worldview that buttresses a closed bureaucratic apparatus. That also means that as a revolutionary Marxist, I'm committed to class struggle, to understanding class struggle as a motor force in political economic change, intensifying class struggle to bring an end to wretched, misery-producing global capitalism. Well, you'll recognize that these are identity statements, that I'm a communist, that I'm a Marxist, and they're identity statements that are strategically deployed here, very different from what I say as a psychoanalyst inside the clinic. Psychoanalysis questions, even unravels identity in the clinic, loosens attachment to forms of identity that lock us in place, whether that's identity in families or relationships or institutions or class status hierarchies. So whatever I say inside the clinic as a psychoanalyst, whatever I say inside the clinic is accorded authority in the transference, which must also eventually, maybe not fully, but must eventually be dissolved. Not by the knowledge that I claim and hold for myself and give to the client in a supposed identity of a psychoanalyst. It's dissolved by them themselves. So here, identity is linked to class, among other things. The authority I'm accorded is shaped, among other things, by class, by my class privilege, or lack of it, depending on how the analysand positions themselves. And psychoanalytic institutions and their trainings are, of course, structured by class. That class structuring of the institutions includes such things as financial resources, education pathways, acculturation into appropriate language codes, usually middle-class language codes. So this is where class seeps into presumptions about identity inside the clinic. It's here that there's a danger of class relations being crystallized as part of the transference in the clinic, effectively functioning as obstacles to an analysand making new decided choices about their lives. Whether that is really a problem or not depends very much on whether any claim to identity by an analysand is treated by them as fixed or fast frozen, or whether it's reflected upon in terms of the sometimes progressive, sometimes regressive work the claim to identity is doing for them. So, basically, we don't moralize. We don't moralize for or against identity in the clinic. Here inside the clinic, class and identity are not, as it were, they're not complementary. And if they do seem to be complementary, then that's a sign of a problem. If anything, they're antagonistic as that between different forms of identity, as productively antagonistic as can be the relationship between the analysand and analyst. That relationship is often antagonistic. So these are things to be worked through, which is not the same as saying that they're things to be resolved, they're things to be worked through. What about outside the clinic? Identity claims function in different ways, sometimes problematic, outside the clinic. And psychoanalysis has something to say about these claims because it is institutionally embedded in these matters. The signifiers that psychoanalysis works with inside the clinic are structured by the very cultural processes that make psychoanalysis as such possible. Sensitivity to political economic issues must be part of psychoanalysis, all the better that the psychoanalyst can thereby leave the politics as such at the clinic door, not to moralize about political choices inside the clinic. There's still a danger, though, that when psychoanalysis is turned from being analysis into a kind of worldview, it does then imagine itself capable of applying itself to politics and kind of decoding it. That is, recoding it in its own particular vocabulary. Then the pretense of all-encompassing foolproof knowledge and the identity of those who speak is itself a danger in psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis itself then risks speaking on the side of Stalinist realism. It thinks it knows what is real, pins itself to what it knows is real, tries to make people conform to that, moralizing in line with power, instead as on the side of open communism, free association. It's when we step outside the clinic and reflect upon the institutions and forms of knowledge that psychoanalysis too often endorses that we can see how versions of Stalinist realism take shape. There's thus an internal political battle that takes shape. Let's call it class struggle inside psychoanalysis. A battle between the closing of knowledge, Stalinist realism, and possibilities for change, open communism. Now, some social theorists were tangled in that kind of question of class struggle when they took the so-called Euro-communist road away from the old closed Marxism of the Moscow-directed communist parties. Again, Laclau and Mouffe are the key figures. The psychoanalysis they employed to theorize the role of signifiers in politics was not the kind of psychoanalysis, this is the good side, it wasn't the kind of psychoanalysis that tells us what identities should count and what identities should not. In this they were correct, I think. They were correct and authentically psychoanalytic, even while the reformist direction of their political engagement was, I think, problematic. So their political direction, I think, is a problem. Stalinist realism, and this is the kind of old, closed Marxism that these people fled from, is actually a worldview that cuts up reality in a certain way and assigns categories of people to different camps and different bodies. So we can see that regimes that inherit the legacy of Stalinism, Russia, China, have very clear ideas about what a family is, what a man is, what a woman is, and what the destiny of a nation is, as well as clear ideas about what does and what does not count as an ethnicity, what does and does not count as a form of sexuality or gender to be recognized. So it attacks those that stray from the approved legitimate boundaries of geography as they imagine it, and biology as they imagine it. So Stalinist realism is also actually obsessed with identity, and it turns the identities it approves of against the ones that it doesn't approve of. So against that, open communism in the domain of politics that works with constellations of identities that operate intersectionally in intimate relation to each other is then seen as a threat by the Stalinist realists. And then the language of the far right against what is termed in that language cultural Marxism and woke politics. Those kinds of things are then taken and wielded as a weapon against open communism by the Stalinist realists. The reformist Eurocommunist turn away from Marxism, and the turn away from class as such was, I think I've made clear, was a false path that dissolved politics. Actually, it dissolved politics into provisional alliances that were often cross-class and demobilizing of the joint struggles of the oppressed. And it's viewed by some self-professed Marxist detractors as a symptom of identity politics itself. So paradoxically, however, it left behind, paradoxically, this Eurocommunist turn left behind a more potent and toxic Stalinist identity politics that now obsesses against any kind of intersectionality that threatens its own map of the world, a fixed map with bodies and nations in their correct place. So here, for them, the Stalinist realists, class is treated as a privileged form of identity that is underpinned by quasi-scientific knowledge. Sometimes it's borrowed from bureaucratized Marxism, sometimes from bourgeois sociology, and that's set against the identities of other oppressed groups, women, the indigenous peoples struggling, and so on. So those other oppressed groups are seen as the antagonistic ones and the divisive ones when they make their own claims in and alongside the working class. And they're seen as complementary and only acknowledged by the Stalinist realists if they agree that their claims to identity have a less solid foundation, less solid than class. To be clear, for revolutionary Marxists, class is not an identity, but it's a relation. What it is to be a worker is, for Marx, to be structurally embedded and constituted as a subject in a relationship of exploitation of their labour. It's a relation, not an identity. And this, as Marx also noted, is in a political economic system, capitalism, in which all that is apparently fixed and fast frozen melts into air. This is a vertiginous, perplexing, alienating condition of life, the kind of thing that frames and bleeds into the distress we meet in the clinic. Everything is changing all the time, but is also invigorating, energizing, and empowering. Those who obsess about class, as if it should be an identity, as if the working class were a kind of self-contained protagonist, those who obsess about other supposed pretenders to identity that are positioned by them as antagonists in this imaginary game, are prey to a double danger. The first aspect of this double danger is that they're relaying into the field of psychoanalytic politics the language of the far right, as well as conceptions of class that are poisonous to creative, enabling, intersectional conceptions of who we are and who we could be. The other aspect of this double danger is that when this too certain, mistaken view of identity finds its way into the clinic, there's a real danger that some forms of identity will be celebrated and others pathologized. And this is indeed where the intersectional nature of politics, including of class politics, becomes salient as a valuable, practical critique of Stalinist realism. Psychoanalysis, as a class stratified institutional practice as well as a clinical practice, is suffused with possibilities of class transition, of the psychoanalysts cleaving to their professional career, of the analysans often hoping that analysis will make them happier, more productive, more successful. And that process needs to be subjected to scrutiny and on the side of the oppressed, instead of obsessing about supposed threats. And here's a favourite target: the threat of proliferating queer transition across sexed bodies that are corroding an otherwise unified working class. Fantasy of a threat. The Stalinist realist transphobes want to lock certain kinds of gender and sexuality into certain kinds of bodies. Not in my clinic. The gender correlate, the clinic correlate of open communism. While the one conceptual political target, class transition, and its conservative homologue, class mobility, supposed things, are part of a meritocratic and conservative image of society that does little to question either the structures or the identities that comprise it. The other target, that which is sometimes viewed with suspicion as woke identity politics, actually gives us a more tactical, reflexive vision of change. The one, a fixation on class, a misrepresentation of what class and class struggle is about and what it aims at, is at one with the broader ideological project of Stalinist realism. The other, which gives us a genuinely historical, materialist way of thinking about classes of people and class as such, is more open, more in tune with the road to open communism. The one is not really psychoanalytic at all. Stalinist realism closes down what Freud drew attention to as the varieties of gender and sexual orientation that people map onto their bodies. While the other, open communism, aims at free association inside and outside the clinic without ever reducing one field of action to the other. So we have a choice here, and I've set out that choice very clearly, I think, and I'm going to end the 3 parts of my talk there. Thank you for listening.